Fog had settled low across the Cumberland Plateau by the time Staff Sergeant Cole Deering turned his truck down the gravel lane of Highway 70, outside Crossville, Tennessee. Past 8 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October. In the passenger seat, Gus lifted his nose from the window crack. Then he turned his whole body toward the house at the end of the lane, which he had never done before on any road they had ever driven together. Through the windshield, Cole could see a small white farmhouse with green shutters and a front porch wrapped in the kind of quiet that is not the same as peaceful, a stillness that sits differently, the way a room sits after something has already happened in it. A light burned in the kitchen window. The curtains were pulled except for one corner, and through that corner a hand rested against the glass. Then the hand pulled back. What Goose did in the next 30 seconds, before Cole had touched the door handle, would tell a Marine who had learned to trust that dog above almost everything that the woman inside that house needed help she had not been permitted to ask for. If you're new to this channel, this is the kind of story we tell here. Stay with me for this one, and subscribe so you don't miss what follows. Cole Deering was 34 years old and had spent most of his adult life being responsible for other people in places where the cost of inattention was irreversible. He had done 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. And he had come back from the last one with both his hands and most of his hearing, and a particular way of entering rooms that his sister called hypervigilance and that Cole called paying attention. And they had argued about the difference more than once, without resolving it. He did handyman work now, had fallen into it the way men who need to keep moving fall into things. It helped a neighbor wrap up a barn one afternoon, and then the neighbor's brother called, and then someone else, and within a year, he had more work than he could take on alone. A hired out of the Veterans Center on Wednesday mornings and ran a 2-man crew most of the week. On the days the jobs didn't fill, he drove the back roads with Gus and stopped wherever something looked like it needed fixing, which in the hill country outside Crossville was most places. It did it because the work kept the other thing, the wide, featureless quiet that waited for him at home, from getting too much room. He had not talked to anyone about the other thing. It had gone once to a veterans group and sat in a circle of folding chairs and listened to men describe things he recognized precisely, and he had not gone back, not because the recognition was wrong, but because it was too right, and he was not ready to sit inside it yet. Goose was a black Labrador mix, 70 pounds, with one ear that stood up and one that folded, and a way of reading a room Cole had never encountered in any other animal. It had been pulled from a shelter in Cookville 3 years ago, listed as aggressive and unadoptable, which had turned out to be wrong on both counts. It was a dog that trusted nobody quickly, and once he decided to trusted you absolutely. Cole had spent 2 weeks on the floor of the shelter run before Gus came to him, and he had understood the patience and respected it still. Goose did not bark at threats. He went quiet. The quieter the dog became, the more serious the assessment. Cole had learned to read the register of that silence, the way he had once read terrain. The call had come from a man named Dennis Pruitt, who lived in Nashville and managed commercial properties and had not reached his mother in 2 weeks. He had found Cole's number through a neighbor. Dennis explained the situation in the flat voice of a man asking someone else to solve a problem he did not want to drive 4 hours to solve himself. Ann Cole had written down the address and said he would check in the following morning. The man living at the house with Ida May, her caretaker, Dennis had called him, a man named Norris Hale, had come through a referral. Reliable, Dennis said. Good, with older people. Cole had not pushed on any of that over the phone. He had just written down the address. It parked at the edge of the gravel lane, 30 feet from the porch. Goose was already at the passenger window, nose going, body taut in a way that was not excitement. Cole clipped the leash out of habit. Job sites, manners, county ordinance, and they walked toward the front porch together. Before they reached the steps, Gus stopped. The growl was low, continuous, the kind that had nothing to do with alarm and everything to do with conclusion. Cole had heard that sound 4 times in 3 years, and every single time something had been wrong. He stood still for a moment and looked at the house the way he had learned to look at things that didn't add up yet, not at the obvious parts, but at the edges, where the story was actually being told. The porch railing had a plastic chair on it, overturned. Not from wind, the morning was still. The front mat was pushed sideways as though someone had moved quickly across it. Through the kitchen window in the gap between curtains, The light was the harsh yellow of a bare bulb, not the warm kind, and the hand that had been against the glass was gone. Cole went to the door and knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then footsteps. 2 sets, he noted, one heavier than the other, and the door opened not all the way but part way, held by a man Cole had not expected. Norris Hale was somewhere in his mid-50s, wide through the shoulders, with the particular kind of smoothness in his expression that Cole associated with men who had practiced being pleasant in order to get things from people. He was wearing a flannel shirt and holding a coffee mug, and he looked at Cole the way a man looks at an appointment he didn't put in his calendar. "Help you?" Norris said. "I'm here to check on Ida Mae Pruitt. Her son Dennis asked me to come by. She's fine." The door did not open further. "She's eating breakfast." "Not a good time." Goose sat down. It did not stop growling. Norris looked at the dog. Something moved across his face. Not fear. Not quite, but the thing that comes before it in a man who has decided he's in control of a situation and then felt that control adjust slightly. "That dog safe?" "Is fine." Cole said, "I'd like to see Ida Mae, please." "Like I said, Dennis Pruitt asked me to check in personally." Cole's voice was the same register it had been since he arrived, even, unhurried. "If she's eating breakfast, I'm happy to wait on the porch." A pause. Then Norris stepped back from the door. Ida Mae Pruitt was 84 years old and had lived in that house for 51 years. She was sitting at the kitchen table in a housecoat and slippers, and she was eating. Crackers, Cole saw. Not breakfast, just crackers on a plate. And when she looked up and saw Cole and the dog in her kitchen doorway, her face did something that took him a moment to name. It was relief. Careful, contained, disciplined relief. The face of a woman who had learned not to show it too quickly. She had white hair, fine and pinned, and eyes that were sharp and watchful in the way of someone who has had to watch carefully for a long time. Her hands, folded on the table beside the cracker plate, were the hands of a woman who had spent decades playing piano. Long-fingered, slightly swollen at the knuckles now, held steel in the way she had likely learned to hold them when her arthritis was bad. "I'm Cole Deering," he said. "Your son Dennis called. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything is fine," Norris said, from behind Cole. Ida Mae looked at Norris. Then she looked at Cole. The two looks were different in a way that told Cole everything he needed to know about the situation in that room. Goose pulled gently on the leash. Not toward Ida Mae, which was his usual move with elderly people, but toward the far side of the kitchen, toward the narrow door beside the refrigerator. Cole let him lead 2 steps and looked. The pantry door had a hasp on it, new hardware, the screws still bright. Through the hasp ran a combination padlock, closed. Cole looked at it for 1 second. Then he looked at the cracker plate on the table. Then he looked at Ida Mae. "I fell against it," Norris said from behind him. "The latch. The wood was already damaged, and I meant to get a proper handle on there. That's next on the list." Cole sighed nothing. He turned away from the pantry and pulled the chair across from Ida Mae and sat down. Norris moved to the kitchen counter. He did not leave the room. Cole asked Ida Mae how she was sleeping. She said fine. He asked if she'd been getting outside. She said when the weather allowed. He asked about her piano. He had noticed the upright through the open parlor door, a beautiful old instrument with sheet music still on the stand. And something in her face changed, went warm, and then careful again, almost in the same breath. "I don't play much anymore," she said. "She forgets the songs," Norris said. From the counter, Ida Mae's hands tightened slightly on each other. She did not look at Norris when he said it. Goose moved to her side of the table, slow and without hurry, and sat down beside her chair. He put his chin on her knee. She looked down at him for a moment with an expression that made Cole's chest do something uncomfortable. Then she put one hand on the top of the dog's head, and her hands stopped being tight. "Have you ever known someone like Ida Mae? Someone who answered every question with fine, because anything else had been made too costly to say? If that person came to mind just now, check on them this week. Type their name in the comments below. They deserve to be remembered." Cole stayed for 40 minutes that first morning. He fixed a gutter brace on the back of the house that had been pulling loose since summer. I could see it from the kitchen window, and it gave him a reason to be there without Norris being able to object. When he left, he sat in his truck at the end of the lane for a few minutes and wrote down what he had seen. The padlock on the pantry, the cracker plate, The piano Ida May no longer played. The way her hands tightened when Norris spoke. The two looks. A called Dennis Pruitt from the road and said that Ida May seemed well, but that he had a few concerns he'd like to follow up on. Then he said, "Thank you," and Cole could hear in his voice the relief of a man who had been told what he wanted to hear and was now putting the phone down. Cole said he'd check back in. Then he sighed great. Cole drove back out to the highway and sat in a turnout and thought about Ray Elkins. Ray had grown up 40 miles south of Crossville, in a county that was all ridges and creek hollows and houses set back from roads that looked exactly like this one. His mother had been a church-going woman who made biscuits on Sunday and grew dahlias in the side yard. Cole had known all of this from the field, from the long hours when men talked about home because it was the only place they could go without moving. Ray Elkins had died in Fallujah in 2006 at 23 years old, and Cole had been 20 yards away and had not been able to do anything about it. He had driven these Tennessee back roads for 3 years, with that knowledge sitting in him like a stone. He could help Ida May. He turned the truck around. He called the county's senior services line from the parking lot of the Dollar General in Crossville and asked about Ida May Pruitt. The woman who answered, whose name was Faye, was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had an open file on that address. Ida May had missed her Tuesday wellness call 2 weeks in a row. Faye had a welfare check scheduled for Friday, but the queue was backed up and she wasn't certain the timing would hold. Friday was 3 days away. Cole asked what a welfare check would require to move faster. Faye cited a secondary report from a non-family individual with direct observation of conditions at the address. Cole said he had that. Faye said she could bump the check to Wednesday if he could send a written statement. He sent it from his truck, typed into his phone, before he left the parking lot. 2 days. On Tuesday afternoon, Cole drove back past the house on a different route, not down the lane, just past the turn on Highway 70. A white cargo van hadn't seen that morning was parked at the head of the lane, facing out, engine cold. He noted the plates and the make and called Marcus Webb, who had done one deployment with Cole and now worked county dispatch, and asked him to run it quietly. Marcus called back in 20 minutes. The van was registered to a property management company in Cookville. Norris Hale was listed as a secondary contact. Norris was moving something, or preparing to. Cole called his neighbor Carl Briggs, who was 69 years old, a deacon at First Baptist on the edge of town, and who had fixed fence line with Cole every spring for 2 years and had the particular quality of a man you could call at any hour with any situation. Cole told Carl what he'd found. Carl listened without interrupting. At the end, he said, Ida May Pruitt played piano at that church for 40 years. She taught Sunday school for 30 of them. Half this town came up under her hands. A pause. What do you need me to do? Cole told him. Carl said he'd make 2 calls. Wednesday arrived gray and cold, a skin of frost on the gravel lane that crunched under tires. Cole pulled up at 8 in the morning with Gus in the passenger seat, and Carl Briggs's truck was already there, and beside it a county services vehicle. Faye, who had driven out early because the secondary statement Cole had filed was, she told him later, the most thorough report she had received in 11 years on that job. The pastor of First Baptist, a man named Reverend Howell, who was 61 years old and had the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, stood at Carl's side in a coat and collar. 4 sets of eyes on that house before the door opened. Norris saw them through the window. Cole watched the curtain move. A minute passed, a minute that had a particular texture, the kind that is full of a man recalculating. And then the door opened. Norris came onto the porch with the coffee mug again and the pleasant expression, and he looked at the small assembly in his driveway with the face of someone deciding which version of himself to present. He chose the reasonable one. Morning. Quite a crowd. Faye identified herself and her role and said she was conducting the scheduled welfare check. Norris said, of course. Come in. Everything's fine. His eyes went to Cole, then to Goose. Goose had not made a sound since they arrived. He stood at Cole's left side with his head level and his ears forward and his body completely still, and his eyes were on Norris Hale with the particular quality of a verdict already rendered. The hair along the back of his neck was raised. They went in. Ida May was in the kitchen. She was dressed, properly dressed, Cole noticed. Not the housecoat, which told him Norris had heard the vehicles and told her to change. She was sitting very straight. Her hands were in her lap. She looked at Cole and then at the Reverend, and something moved in her face, something she controlled quickly but not quickly enough. Reverend Howell went to her and took both her hands and said, Ida Mae, we came to see you. She looked at her hands inside his, and her chin moved, and she held it still. Norris was explaining something to Faye near the doorway. The routine, the medications, the schedule. His voice, the practice smooth of a man who has explained it many times and found that people usually accepted it. Faye was writing on her clipboard. She was not looking at Norris's face. She was looking at the kitchen. Goose went to the pantry door and sat down. He did not bark. He did not whine. He sat precisely in front of the padlocked hasp, and he looked at it, and then he looked at Cole. And that was the entirety of the message. Cole said to Norris, Could you open the pantry? It's just storage, Norris said. The latch is broken. I told you that yesterday. I'd like it open, please. I don't have the combination on me right now. Norris. The voice that came out of Cole Deering was not loud. It was not threatening in any way that could be pointed to. It was the voice of a man who had been in rooms where the stakes were actual, and who had learned that the quietest version of authority was the one that couldn't be argued with, because it had nothing to prove. Norris stopped talking. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Faye's going to need to see inside that pantry as part of her check. That's a standard component of a nutritional welfare assessment. If you don't have the combination, she'll note that the access was denied. That note goes into the file. Faye looked up from her clipboard. That's correct, she said. Norris looked at Faye. He looked at the Reverend. He looked at Carl Briggs, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and 69 years of patience on his face. It took a key from his pocket and opened the padlock. The pantry held 8 cans of soup on one shelf, a box of crackers, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. For one person. For a week, if measured carefully. The remaining 3 shelves were bare. Faye wrote for a long time on her clipboard. Ida Mae had watched all of it from her chair. Her back was straight, and her hands were folded, and she was looking at Norris with an expression that was not anger. It was something older and quieter than anger. The face of a woman who had waited to be seen and was now finally being seen. Norris turned toward her. He began to speak. Something about arrangements, about plans, about a delivery that had been delayed. The logic, cracking now, searching for new shape. Ida Mae looked at him. She said, I hid a cracker under the bed. 7 words. The room went still the way rooms go still when something true has been said that cannot be unsaid. Carl Briggs uncrossed his arms. Faye stopped writing. Reverend Howell's hand tightened around Ida Mae's. Goose moved from the pantry to the space between Ida Mae's chair and where Norris stood, and he positioned himself there. He swayed forward, his eyes fixed on Norris, the growl beginning again. Low, continuous, the sound of a decision with no give in it. When Norris shifted his weight, the dog's head dropped slightly. Norris went still. Cole looked at Norris Hale and spoke in the same even register he had used since he arrived on Monday morning. Faye is going to complete her assessment. She'll need to see every room. She'll need to see the medication records. She'll need the documents related to the power of attorney that was filed 6 weeks ago with Ida Mae's name on it. Because Ida Mae's son has confirmed to me this morning that he did not authorize one and that his mother has not mentioned one to him. He paused for one beat. If that paperwork is in this house, today is a good day for it to surface. Norris looked at Faye. Faye looked back at him without expression. He looked at the Reverend. The Reverend looked back at him, the way men of faith look at things they have already named for what they are. He looked at Gus. Goose did not move. The growl did not change. The dog did not look away. Norris Hale set his coffee mug on the counter. He looked at the door. He looked at Cole once more. The look of a man taking inventory of a situation and finding that every number had changed. He left. Goose watched him through the kitchen window until the white van was gone from the lane. Then he turned. He walked to Ida Mae and put his chin on her knee and closed his eyes. And she bent forward and put both arms around his neck, the way you hold something you thought had been taken from you and got back. And she stayed there for a long time. Nobody spoke. The power of attorney was found in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser. A forensic examiner later confirmed the signature did not match Ida May's known exemplars. Norris Hale was charged with elder financial exploitation and document fraud 6 weeks after he left that kitchen. Dennis Pratt drove up from Nashville on Thursday. He sat at his mother's kitchen table for 4 hours, and Cole heard later from Carl that the conversation had been hard and necessary, and that Dennis had left looking like a man who had just understood something about himself that he had been avoiding for years. The congregation at First Baptist organized a meals rotation that covered every day of the week through winter. Carl replaced the pantry door hasp on a Saturday morning, so Ida May could watch, and she watched with both hands around a cup of coffee and her back straight. On the first Sunday after Norris was gone, Ida May sat down at the upright piano in her parlor and played from memory, a hymn she had been playing since she was 9 years old. Air hands, finding the keys the way hands find things they have always known. She played it through once, then twice. On the third time, Cole was sitting in the parlor doorway on the floor with his back against the frame, and Gus beside him. And the music came through the house the way heat comes through a house that has been cold for a long time. Cole had not cried since Fallujah. He had made a particular arrangement with himself about that. It did not break it then, but it was a closer thing than it had been in years, and he sat with that and he let the music do what it was doing. And after a while, Goose put his heavy head on Cole's knee, and Cole put one hand on the dog's ear and did not move it. There are moments that feel less like chance and more like assignment, like something older than logistics arranged for two people to meet each other at the same time in the same place, in the same cold October, and then sent a dog to make sure neither of them drove past. Cole Deering had been running from a quiet house for 3 years. That Sunday morning, for the first time he could name, the quiet was not empty. It was full of piano music and a dog's slow breathing, and the particular peace that comes to a room after a long wrong has finally been righted. He didn't drive past. This story is for every person living in a house where someone has taken more than they were given, and for every person who almost kept driving and then didn't. Is there an Ida May in your life? A neighbor you've been meaning to check on? A parent someone else is supposed to be handling? Someone whose light is on but who doesn't come to the door the way they used to? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one, and this section fills up with names of people who deserve to be remembered. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to drive past. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.